Beneath the heart of Rome, beyond the marble halls and golden altars of St. Peter's Basilica, lies a door, not one you will ever find on a tourist map. It is locked behind iron gates buried under centuries of dust, guarded by silence as much as by stone. Behind that door stretches 85 kilometers of shelves, millions of pages, forgotten letters from popes, secret treaties with emperors, trial records of heretics, unsent confessions, forbidden gospels, and even works of art deemed too dangerous for human eyes. For over 12 centuries, these archives have held what history chose to forget, or what power decided we were not ready to know. They are not merely a record of faith. They are a record of fear, of doubt, of choices so heavy that the church itself trembled to speak them aloud. This is not a story about conspiracy. It is a story about memory, buried, silenced, waiting. And tonight we open that door. Not to repeat the official version, but to walk into the shadows where truth has always been kept. What you're about to hear will shake the ground beneath what you thought you knew. We will descend into chapters of history never told in school books. Gospels that were cut from the Bible. Popes who begged for peace in secret but were silenced. Miracles the church feared more than heresy. And rituals written to prepare for the day the Vatican itself might fall. This journey is not about faith versus doubt. It is about how far humanity will go to guard what it fears is too true to face. If you believe truth deserves to be heard, if you want to walk deeper into the silence that shaped our world, then stay with me until the last page, the last word, the last secret. Subscribe, follow, share. Each action is not just support, it's like lighting a candle inside the darkness of an archive where memory has waited centuries to be seen again. Because in the end, the Vatican archives do not belong only to Rome. They belong to time. And now, they belong to you. The Vatican is not merely a city within a city. It is a fortress of silence. And beneath that silence lies something far more dangerous than weapons or armies. Memory. Beneath the beating heart of Rome, past the marble pillars and the golden sunlight of St. Peter's Square, there is a place that most who worship never even know exists. It is not announced in the church bulletins. It does not appear on glossy tourist brochures. It cannot be entered by accident. It waits. 3 layers of iron doors, bolted to stone that swallows every echo. Halls where footsteps vanish as quickly as they arrive. Shelves that run for 85 kilometers, stacked with manuscripts, letters, maps, and secrets. They call it the Vatican Secret Archive. But the truth is stranger than the name itself. The word secretum in Latin never meant hidden in shame. It meant private, a vault for popes and popes alone. But if secrecy was innocent, why do these doors feel more like the gates of a tomb? I was not a cardinal. I was not a historian with accolades. I was not born into noble bloodlines or whispered into these halls by privilege. I was something more insignificant and in some ways more dangerous. I was a caretaker, a custode. My duty was to clean dust, to sharpen quills for the scholars granted limited access, and to carry permitted folders from desk to desk. That should have been the end of it. Yet the greatest horrors often begin not with grand intentions, but with quiet disobedience. On certain nights when the old priest responsible for watching the rooms fell asleep beside his lamp, I would move silently. The flame barely quivered as I pressed against those forbidden doors. And once I stepped inside, I knew there would be no return. What I saw is not what the world imagines. No angels descended, no curse struck me down. Instead, there was something worse. The sound of my own heartbeat in a place that seemed not to allow life at all. The air was heavy, stale, almost metallic. Shelves rose like endless forests of oak and parchment. Each drawer whispered a temptation. Open me. And when I did, I discovered fragments of history that had been buried, not because they were false, but because they were too true. Letters by popes that were never sent. Drafts of speeches that, had they been spoken, might have changed wars, spared lives, or shattered the church itself. Paintings too human, too painful to be displayed under the light of stained glass. Documents that revealed not lies, but choices. Choices too complicated for public faith to endure. I did not realize then what I understand now. The Vatican does not guard lies. It guards truths that burn too brightly. And as I stood in that forbidden corridor with trembling hands and a mind torn between devotion and dread, I realized something else. Not all doors are meant to be opened. Yet I had opened them. And in doing so, I had crossed a line that even God perhaps might not forgive. This is not a story about conspiracy. Conspiracies are cheap. They comfort the mind with simple villains and simple plots. This is something else. A story about memory itself. What humanity chooses to remember and what it chooses to bury alive. And as you listen to what I uncovered in those endless shelves, I must warn you. This is not a tale of angels or demons. This is the story of silence. And silence has always been the most dangerous weapon of all. But the first time I truly understood the weight of silence was not when I touched the ink of a forgotten pope, but when I found a drawer that contained nothing at all. A space deliberately left empty. And that absence spoke louder than any document ever could. The first time the Vatican's archives shook me to my core was not when I saw blood-stained parchments or whispered letters of popes. It was when I found a drawer labeled with a single name. Galileo. Inside were fragile papers browned with time, trembling at the edges as if they had endured centuries of silent fire. The ink was faded, but the voice within was unmistakable. A man who dared to argue that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but a planet adrift around the sun. In 1613, Galileo Galilei wrote a letter to the Church, attempting not to defy faith but to reconcile it with reason. Scripture teaches us how one goes to heaven, he argued, not how the heavens go. It was a plea for harmony. Science as observation, Scripture as salvation. But harmony is dangerous when it threatens authority. In 1616, heliocentrism was declared heresy. By 1633, Galileo stood trial before the Inquisition. I held the transcript of his interrogation in my hands. His voice was not loud, not rebellious. It was the voice of a man weary of fighting a tide larger than himself. I do not hold, nor have I held this opinion, after being admonished by the Holy Office. He was forced to kneel and recant, whispering the words that history would never forget. Eppur si muove. And yet it moves. Why would the Vatican bury such records in the deepest shadows? Because to admit Galileo's truth too soon would unravel more than astronomy. If Earth was not the center, then man was not the center. If man was not the center, then faith itself might begin to tremble. The documents revealed something chilling. The trial was less about stars and planets and more about fear. Fear that one man's telescope could fracture the cosmic order upon which the Church had built its throne. One margin note by a cleric struck me harder than Galileo's own words. If we allow this, doctrine wavers. If we deny it, history will never forgive us. Doctrine or forgiveness. There was no victory, only two different forms of ruin. Centuries later, the Vatican quietly rehabilitated Galileo. In 1992, Pope John Paul II formally admitted the Church's mistake. But even that apology was cautious, measured, softened by the weight of time. And yet when I read those yellowed pages in silence, I realized something terrifying. The Church did not fear lies. It feared truths too powerful, too destabilizing, too alive. Science, after all, does not knock politely. It tears open the sky. As I left that drawer behind, I could not stop thinking of our own age. Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, the possibility of life beyond Earth. Are these not the new telescopes of Galileo? Will today's truths one day be hidden in drawers, sealed away until the world is ready to face them? The Vatican archives taught me this. It is not the unknown that terrifies us most. It is the known, waiting in silence until we are brave enough or foolish enough to look it in the eye. But if Galileo's trial revealed how truth could be silenced, the next drawer I opened showed something darker. Truth not silenced but deliberately erased. The fate of the Knights Templar, betrayed, absolved in secret, and left to burn in history's fire. When you walk through the archives, you expect dust, silence, the smell of ancient parchment. What you do not expect are the whispers. Voices that seem to seep out of the very pages themselves. Murmurs of men branded as heretics. Men who once carried the sword in Christ's name and then perished in fire because the Church declared them enemies. One night I opened a chest so old that the hinges crumbled at my touch. Inside was a bundle of parchment tied with blackened string. The ink faded to the color of dried blood. The label read, Processus contra Templarios, the trial of the Templars. The Knights Templar had been the guardians of pilgrims, the bankers of Europe, the soldiers of God's wars. But power is a treacherous thing, and by the early 1300s their wealth rivaled that of kings. That is when King Philip the Famoform of France turned his greed into a holy charge. He accused the Templars of heresy, of spitting on the cross, of secret rituals, of worshipping false idols. Thousands were arrested, tortured, burned. The world believed they had been damned, erased forever. But in 2001, an Italian scholar, Barbara Frail, uncovered what had been sleeping in the Vatican all along. A parchment hidden in the depths of the archives. revealing that Pope Clement XII had quietly absolved the Templars of heresy. The document lay before me, its Latin script delicate yet ironclad. For 700 years, the Church had known they were not guilty, yet the order still perished in fire. Why? The answer was scrawled in a chilling side note by a papal advisor. Their innocence cannot preserve them. To defend them would destroy us. The Templars were not the only voices preserved in this grim corridor. In another drawer lay the transcripts of Giordano Bruno, philosopher, mystic, and visionary of an infinite universe. Bruno believed in worlds beyond ours and countless stars burning with life. His vision was not blasphemy, it was awe. But awe that contradicted doctrine became heresy. The records revealed his trial in meticulous detail. Priests questioned him for months, demanding recantation. His answers were steady, unwavering. If God is infinite, then creation must be infinite. In the margin of one interrogation, a nameless cleric scribbled, "If we spare him, doctrine wavers. If we burn him, history will never forgive us." And so in 1600, Bruno was dragged to Campo dei Fiori and burned alive. The ashes of his body scattered into the Roman air. But the words remained, preserved in ink, hidden in drawers that no one dared to open until centuries later. The archives also hold secrets of a different kind. Not just blood, but fragile attempts at peace. In the early days of the Reformation, letters between Martin Luther and Vatican envoys were carefully copied and stored. Historians like to paint the split as inevitable. Luther nailing his theses, Rome condemning him, the world tearing in two. But here, in trembling brown ink, I read words that revealed another truth. There had been a moment, brief and fragile, when unity was still possible. In one letter, a Vatican theologian wrote, "If concessions are made, unity may endure." And Luther's reply, hesitant yet firm, "If faith cannot be bought, truth cannot be bargained." The negotiations collapsed, pride triumphed, and the schism that tore Christianity in two was sealed. As I closed the box, my hand shook. These were not myths, these were not conspiracies. These were choices made by men who feared weakness more than they feared sin. The Templars, erased despite absolution. Bruno burned for seeing the stars too clearly. Luther divided from Rome by words that might have been softened but weren't. The Vatican did not hide these truths because they were false. It preserved them because they are too heavy to carry in the light. And as I walked out of that shadowed aisle, I felt a cold realization. The line between heresy and truth is not drawn in heaven. It is drawn by trembling human hands. But the archives did not stop at faith's betrayals. In the next chamber, I uncovered the darkest marriage of all, where faith and empire walked hand in hand. Maps of lands divided by papal decree, letters soaked in conquest, and the chilling truth that sometimes the cross marched beside the sword. The Vatican archives are not only about theology or lost letters from popes. They are also about maps. Maps drawn in red and black ink, with neat Latin inscriptions across oceans that had barely been crossed, dividing continents as if they were chessboards. It was here, in these brittle sheets of parchment, that I first understood how faith can walk alongside the blade of empire. One document, carefully sealed with crimson wax, carried a name whispered with both reverence and horror: Inter Caetera, issued by Pope Alexander VI in 1493. It was written just 1 year after Christopher Columbus returned from his first voyage to the Americas. The ink on the decree was still bold, the language unnervingly simple. The Pope, as if he were judge of the earth itself, divided the newly discovered non-Christian world between Spain and Portugal. One side of a line on a map would belong to Spain, the other to Portugal. Millions of souls, countless cultures, entire continents, reduced to neat territorial zones gifted with the authority of divine sanction. I read the words and I felt a chill. This was not just geography, it was theology turned into politics. Faith had become a weapon sharper than any sword. A note in the margin, written in another hand, summed up the horror perfectly. The Church claims no land for itself, yet by blessing others it takes all. Attached to this decree were letters from monarchs, kings who bowed to the Pope with one hand while sending soldiers and ships with the other. They promised the spread of Christianity in exchange for papal approval of their conquests. But tucked among these royal proclamations were voices of protest. A Dominican friar, Bartolomé de las Casas, wrote directly to Pope Paul III in 1537, "I have seen blood flow like rivers in the New World. I have seen women and children burned, their cries drowned beneath the chanting of psalms. If this is the cost of salvation, then we have lost God." That letter was not destroyed. It was preserved. Perhaps as a silent acknowledgement that conscience had tried to speak even when it was ignored. And yet even Paul III issued a decree, Sublimis Deus, declaring that indigenous peoples had souls, that they should not be enslaved. For a moment, there was hope. But the archives tell a crueler truth. That decree was withdrawn under pressure from kings who could not afford morality. The ink of popes could not outweigh the steel of monarchs. The archives did not end with the Americas. In another bundle of parchment, I found letters between Vatican officials and missionaries in Asia. One dossier described Vietnam in the late 18th century. Bishop Pinot de Behaine wrote to Rome about his alliance with Prince Nguyen An, later Emperor Jialong, offering spiritual guidance while helping secure weapons and troops. Faith was no longer merely salvation, it had become strategy, part of the machinery of nation building. Another file described secret correspondence with Japan during the Tokugawa shogunate. Christianity had been banned, yet letters smuggled inside wooden statues carried Rome's messages. "We respect your knowledge and loyalty, though we do not accept a faith that divides families. Faith and diplomacy intertwined like shadowy vines." In every corner of empire, religion was not separate. It was entangled, inseparable from conquest, resistance, and survival. But what haunted me most came not from the 16th century, but from the 19th. A single report dated 1885, written by a French bishop stationed in the Congo. His handwriting was sharp, almost violent, as if his pen had carved the truth into paper. "I have seen men with their hands cut off for failing to meet rubber quotas." The cries of children echo in the jungle. We cannot say Mass without stepping over bodies. He begged the Vatican to intervene against King Leopold II's brutality. The response was brief, chillingly so. We pray for them. Intervention is beyond reach. Pray, but do nothing. Faith reduced to silence in the face of mutilation. As I closed those files, I felt as though I had touched the very nerve of history's hypocrisy. The Church never swung the sword directly, yet it blessed the hand that did. It offered salvation while standing beside slaughter, and yet hidden in the archives there were sparks of resistance. Priests who wrote against the bloodshed, popes who tried too weakly to forbid slavery, missionaries who spoke more of compassion than conquest. Their words were not enough to stop the tide, but they endure, preserved like faint stars against a black sky. The Vatican did not hide these records to erase its complicity. It preserved them because the truth is too complex for easy judgment. Faith was not innocent, but neither was it always guilty. It was caught in the same trap as every empire, the temptation to wield morality as a weapon, and the fear of what happens when that weapon fails. But if colonialism showed how faith could be twisted into empire, the next corridor revealed something even darker. The silence of faith during humanity's darkest hour. The Holocaust. Letters unread, speeches unwritten, and prayers that came too late. When I first stepped into the section of the archives marked Pius XII, I expected dust and fragile ink. What I did not expect was the weight. The crushing silence of millions of unheard voices pressed into brittle paper and sealed behind iron doors for decades. The world calls him the Pope of Silence. Some say he did too little too late. Others say he acted in secret, quietly saving thousands. But in these archives, the truth is more complicated, more terrifying. It is a truth written in missing speeches, unanswered letters, and prayers that never crossed the Vatican's marble walls. I opened a folder labeled Lettere non risposte, unanswered letters. The first was from August 1942, written by a rabbi in Slovakia. We do not ask for a public intervention. We only ask that you affirm that God is not silent. No reply was attached, only a pencil note in the margin. Forwarded to Secretariat, response pending. But the response never came. Another letter came from Poland in 1942. It described mass deportations, families torn from homes, children crying out as trains rolled toward unknown destinations. The letter begged, "Say something, Your Holiness. Even a single word." Again, silence. And yet, tucked deeper in the file was a draft of a papal speech from Christmas Eve 1942. It bore the haunting title Sicut Stellae in Nocte, like stars in the night. In it, one line struck me like a knife. We grieve for the millions of innocents destroyed, whether for their race, their faith, or their language. But that speech was never delivered. A note beside it read, "Would endanger German parishes, must wait." The waiting never ended. In another file, I found a report dated October 16, 1943. It described the deportation of nearly 1,000 Jews from Rome, just streets away from St. Peter's Basilica. They were loaded onto trains at Tiburtina station, their destination marked as unknown. Attached to the report was a trembling handwritten note, unsigned. Could not prevent. Prayer is the last recourse. That phrase repeated itself like a curse throughout the archives. Prayer is the last recourse. But the story is not only silence. Hidden among these files were records of secret aid, monasteries and convents sheltering Jews under false names, baptism certificates forged to provide new identities. One list chilled me more than any other. 44 names carefully written in ink, each with an address and the note sheltered at Santa Brigida Convent. Cross-referenced records revealed that of the 44, only 12 survived. I stared at that page until the ink blurred in my vision. They had tried, but the attempt was drowned in the scale of the horror. As I sat there, surrounded by these letters, I felt the silence pressing against my chest like stone. The Vatican did not lie. It did not deny. It preserved everything, the pleas, the drafts, the whispers of conscience. But what it offered the world at the time was silence. And silence, the face of genocide, is its own kind of answer. One line from a Vatican memo written during the war haunts me still. To choose between voice and life, no one is holy enough to choose rightly. Perhaps that was true. Perhaps no choice could have saved them all. But the silence of the church remains one of history's deepest shadows. At the far end of this section, I found a folder labeled Discorsi Mancanti, missing speeches. It contained drafts of papal addresses never delivered. One was dated Easter 1943. In it, the Pope had written, "We cannot close our eyes to the cries of a people cast out. Though they do not bear the name of Christ, they are still human beings." That passage was crossed out in red. Beside it, a stamp read, "Reservato non dare," reserved, do not publish. I closed the folder with trembling hands. The silence of a single man had echoed through millions of deaths. The archives do not accuse, they do not absolve, they preserve. And in that preservation lies a judgment heavier than any tribunal. Not what the Vatican said, but what it chose not to say. As I left that section, I did not feel anger. I felt something colder. The kind of horror that comes not from violence, but from absence. From the knowledge that sometimes the most terrifying words in history are the ones never spoken. But if silence was the Church's greatest sin in the Holocaust, the next chamber revealed an even older kind of silence. The silence of popes who wrote letters they never dared to send. Confessions, doubts, and warnings that were folded, sealed, and locked away, waiting for eyes like mine to uncover them centuries later. Not all secrets in the Vatican are proclamations carved into marble or decrees sealed with crimson wax. Some are softer, more fragile, written by trembling hands in the dead of night, folded, hidden, and never sent. These are the letters of the popes that never reached their destinations. And in them, the heads of the Catholic Church are not figures of marble or symbols of eternity. They are men, afraid, doubtful, broken. I found the collection in a long, unmarked cabinet, its wood darkened by centuries. Inside was a folder labeled in a hand I did not recognize. Lettere non inviate, Letters never sent. The first letter I touched was dated 1917, written by Pope Benedict XV in the middle of the First World War. It was addressed to the leaders of Europe. His words were desperate, pleading, "If this war continues, humanity will not only lose lives, it will lose its soul." The thunder of artillery drowns the voice of God, but the letter was never dispatched. A cardinal's note on the margin struck me harder than the Pope's words. "No one will listen. If they do, your holiness will appear weak." The Pope's plea for peace was buried and the world bled on. Another document chilled me even more. A 1938 memorandum written by Pope Pius the Vatican just months before his death. It was meant as a directive for his successor. He warned of the creeping rise of fascism across Europe and wrote in fierce, almost trembling lines, "If we remain silent, history will not speak of our wisdom. It will speak of our complicity." He intended to issue an encyclical condemning anti-Semitism and totalitarianism. But he died before he could make it public. The draft remained here, preserved like a ghost of a voice that never reached the world. But not all of these letters were warnings to nations. Some were confessions, private doubts written by men who wore the fisherman's ring but could not remove the weight from their hearts. I came across a letter by Pope John Paul II, never published, written in the 1990s during the growing sexual abuse crisis. His handwriting was simple, his words unbearably human. "I do not know if I have done enough. Every night I pray not only for forgiveness from God, but from the victims I will never meet." The letter was folded once, never signed, and placed in a folder marked simply "Riservato," reserved. Another letter, attributed to Pope Francis in his early years of papacy, was a draft addressed to a disgraced cardinal convicted of abuse. The Pope's words were not absolution, but anguish. The sin of the individual does not destroy the church, but the covering up does. That line was underlined 3 times, yet the letter was never sent. One file froze me in place. It contained notes from Pope John Paul II, who reigned for only 33 days before his sudden death in 1978. His letter, handwritten and sharp, revealed his intent to reform the Vatican Bank, to end corruption, to purge secret accounts tied to Italian power brokers. In it, he wrote one sentence that made my chest tighten. "The Church cannot preach purity if it is not transparent itself." That letter never left the archives. John Paul, I never lived to see his reforms through. Some say he died of natural causes, others whisper darker possibilities. But the truth is here in his own handwriting. He had begun to pull at threads the Church could not allow to unravel. I had come to the Vatican expecting to see men of certainty, leaders untouched by doubt. But these letters revealed the opposite. They were not saints carved in stone. They were men caught between conscience and power, between the urge to speak and the terror of being ignored, condemned, or silenced. Some begged for peace and were buried. Some warned against evil and died before their words could reach the world. Some confessed sins the faithful never imagined popes could carry. And yet all of them remain here, preserved in silence, not to absolve, not to accuse, simply to remind us that even the highest throne in Christendom is still a seat occupied by a human being. As I closed the folder, I realized the cruel irony. These popes commanded armies of priests, influenced kings, guided millions of believers. Yet in their most private moments, they were voiceless. The world would never hear their cries, their doubts, their desperate warnings, until centuries later when someone like me opened a drawer and read them in the flicker of a candle. The archives do not just preserve history. They preserve the silence of men who were supposed to speak for God, but often could not even speak for themselves. But the letters were not the only secrets of silence. In the next chamber, I would discover crimes committed inside the Vatican itself. Murders, thefts, and disappearances, all hidden behind holy walls, all recorded in chilling detail. For the archives do not only guard faith, they guard sin. Faith may drape itself in gold, but shadows creep beneath the velvet. The Vatican archives do not only hold sermons and letters of saints. They hold records of crimes committed in the very heart of the Holy See. Murders whispered about in the corridors. Banks that bled money like open wounds. Disappearances never explained, only footnoted in Latin reports with the chilling word irrisolto. Unresolved. It is here in these pages that holiness and corruption become impossible to separate. One heavy dossier bore the emblem of the Istituto per le Opere di Religione, the Vatican Bank. Inside were reports from the late 1970s and 1980s, when the bank became entangled with the notorious Banco Ambrosiano. Pages of ledgers recorded millions flowing through hidden accounts, funneled into weapons deals, Italian politics, and criminal networks. The name that appeared most often was Roberto Calvi, the Italian banker later found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London in 1982. In the margins of one Vatican memo, a single word had been scrawled in shaky handwriting: Traditus, betrayed. Beside it, another note: he knew too much. The implication was unmistakable. The Vatican had been entangled in corruption so deep that even bankers became pawns and casualties. And then there was the death of Pope John Paul III. Just 33 days after his election, he was found dead in his chambers. Officially, it was a heart attack. But a confidential file marked Riservato non publicare painted a darker picture. In it, investigators noted inconsistencies. The sudden replacement of papal doctors, the missing medical report, and the Pope's own letters about reforming the Vatican Bank. One passage in his own handwriting declared, "I cannot allow the Church to serve Mammon under the name of Christ." Days later, he was gone. The archives do not accuse. They do not name assassins. But in the silence of their pages lies a question that has never been answered. Did a pope die of natural causes? Or was his death the final ledger entry in a book of corruption? Another file was thinner but more haunting. It was labeled Emanuela Orlandi, 1983. Emanuela was a 15-year-old girl, the daughter of a Vatican employee, who vanished on her way home from music class. The file contained transcripts of phone calls received by her family. Anonymous voices linking her disappearance to demands for the release of Mehmet Ali Aka, the man who had attempted to assassinate Pope John Paul II. But deeper in the folder, I found reports suggesting something darker. Rumors of internal Vatican involvement, connections to organized crime, even whispers of a cover-up. One Vatican official's note chilled me. Certain stones must never be overturned lest the whole structure collapse. Emanuela's fate remains unknown, her case unsolved, and yet here in the archives her name is preserved, forever tied to the shadows of the Holy See. The most grotesque file I found was marked with a black ribbon, Guardia Svizzera, 1998. It contained police photographs, blurred with age, of the bodies of Alois Estermann, commander of the Swiss Guard, his wife, and a young corporal named Cedric Tournay. The official version declared it a murder-suicide. Tournay had killed his commander and the commander's wife before turning the gun on himself. But the Vatican's internal report told another story. It spoke of hidden tensions, secret relationships, and political power struggles within the Guard itself. Margins carried cryptic notes like, "Silence preferable to scandal." The truth was drowned beneath layers of secrecy. As I turned page after page, a sickening realization spread through me. Holiness does not erase sin. It cloaks it. The Vatican, in its obsession with preserving appearances, has at times become an accomplice, not to conspiracy theories, but to very real crimes. These were not myths of poisoned chalices or cursed relics. They were embezzlements, murders, and disappearances, sins committed not in the shadows of pagan temples, but inside the walls of the world's most sacred city. The archives preserved them not to glorify, but to remember, to remind the future that even the holiest robes can conceal unholy stains. And as I set the files back in their places, the candlelight flickering against their covers, I felt a chill that no prayer could dispel. The realization that faith is not destroyed by sin. It is destroyed by silence in the face of sin. But not all the archives hid crimes. Some hid beauty, paintings and sculptures never seen by the faithful, works by Michelangelo and Caravaggio, judged too dangerous not because they lied, but because they revealed too much of the human soul. And what I saw in those secret portfolios shook me more than any crime. Faith is meant to lift the eyes to heaven, but sometimes beauty drags the gaze back down to the earth, to flesh, to pain, to desire. And in those moments, beauty becomes dangerous. The Vatican archives do not only preserve papal decrees and diplomatic letters. They also hold portfolios bound in leather, filled with sketches, drafts, and paintings by the greatest artists of Christendom. But not all of these works ever saw the light of a chapel or museum. Some were hidden, condemned not because they were false, but because they revealed too much. The first portfolio I opened bore the name Buonarroti, Michelangelo. Inside were drawings that no tourist in the Sistine Chapel has ever seen. They were studies for his frescoes, but more intimate, more raw. Naked bodies twisted in agony, muscles pulled taut in suffering, faces not of angels, but of men on the brink of despair. One sketch showed Christ not as a triumphant king, but as a gaunt, broken figure, his head bowed, his face etched with exhaustion. Beside it, in a papal hand, someone had written, "Too human." That was the crime. Michelangelo's Christ was not distant, not untouchable. He was one of us, fragile, wounded, weak, and for the church, such humanity was dangerous. Another folder revealed a painting by Raphael, a study for a Madonna. At first glance, it was as serene as any other, but in this version, the Virgin's eyes were swollen with tears. Her hands clutched the child not in peace, but in desperation, as if she already knew the fate awaiting him. The accompanying note declared, "The faithful must not see a mother's despair. They must see only glory." The painting was locked away, hidden from the faithful who could not be allowed to imagine the Virgin not as a queen, but as a mother afraid for her child. And then there was Caravaggio, the painter of shadows, the artist who made holiness bleed. The archives contained a canvas long wrapped in cloth. When I unrolled it, I froze. It was a crucifixion unlike any I had ever seen. The nails were not yet driven. Christ's hand trembled as soldiers pressed iron against his skin. His eyes were wide, not divine, not serene, but terrified. It was unbearable to look at, not because it was blasphemous, but because it was true. A note pinned to the back read, "This painting makes the faithful doubt the strength of the Savior. Better to preserve silence." And so the painting was never hung. It was buried in darkness where only archivists and ghosts could see it. In these portfolios, I realized something profound. Beauty terrifies more than blasphemy. Blasphemy can be dismissed as heresy, as madness. But beauty, true beauty, forces you to confront what you believe, to see divinity not as perfection but as suffering, not as unreachable light but as fragile humanity. The church feared this not because it was false, but because it was too powerful. A painting of Christ in agony, of Mary in despair, of saints in weakness, could shake more faith than any heretic's speech. As I carefully closed each folder, I felt as though I had trespassed not only into forbidden art, but into forbidden truth. The Vatican had preserved these works not to erase them, but to keep them from the eyes of a world not ready to see holiness in pain, in doubt, in terror. And I wondered, what would happen if these works were ever revealed? Would the faithful lose belief? Or would they finally understand that the sacred is not only found in perfection, but in imperfection? Perhaps that is the real danger. Perhaps beauty reveals a God who bleeds, a Madonna who weeps, and a church that fears what its faithful might see in the mirror of art. But if forbidden beauty shook my soul, the next files chilled me even deeper. For they spoke not of art or flesh, but of visions, apparitions of the Virgin, prophecies of the end, messages judged too terrifying, too dangerous to ever be shown to the faithful. The Vatican archives are filled with parchments inked by popes, kings, and cardinals. But in one shadowed wing lies something different. Not decrees, not diplomacy, but whispers from heaven. Or what some believe to be heaven. Here are the records of miracles, apparitions, and prophecies. Yet instead of glory, these files are marked with hesitation. The church listened, observed, sometimes even wept. But then it chose silence, because nothing shakes faith more than a voice that claims to speak for God. especially when that voice contradicts the church itself. It begins in Portugal, 1917. 3 children claimed the Virgin Mary appeared to them in the fields of Fatima. On the appointed day, tens of thousands gathered. They swore the sun danced, that it spun in the sky and hurled colors across the earth. Some said their soaked clothes dried instantly. Others fell to their knees in terror, convinced the world was ending. The Vatican's file on Fatima is thick, bound in leather. Inside are photographs, transcripts of interrogations, even medical records of the witnesses. One chilling annotation reads, "The phenomenon is consistent in testimony but unconfirmed by instruments." The church eventually approved Fatima for devotion, but not for doctrine. Why? Because one of the so-called secrets of Fatima warned of apocalyptic wars, persecution of the church, and even a pope falling beneath gunfire. For decades, the third secret remained locked away. Some claim it described nuclear fire raining upon the earth. Others insist it spoke of corruption inside the Vatican itself. The document was finally revealed in 2000, but many believe what was shown was not the true version. The question remains, did the Virgin really speak, or did the Church bury the most terrifying prophecy of all? Another file, Lourdes, 1858. A peasant girl named Bernadette swore the Virgin appeared to her at a grotto, telling her to dig in the earth. A spring burst forth, and soon pilgrims claimed miraculous healings after touching its waters. The Vatican's investigators recorded every detail: blood tests, doctors' testimonies, and witness reports. In one file, a physician wrote, "No natural explanation for recovery, yet no evidence of supernatural cause." The Church cautiously accepted Lourdes, not the visions but the healings. It was safer to affirm water than to confirm words from heaven. In 1973, in the mountains of Akita, Japan, a wooden statue of the Virgin was said to weep human tears. Witnesses reported blood and sweat seeping from the carving. A deaf nun claimed to hear a voice warning of fire falling from the sky, annihilating much of humanity. The Vatican's files contain chemical analyses of the liquid. It was indeed human fluid, unexplainable but undeniable. Yet the official conclusion was muted. Worthy of belief for private devotion, not binding on the faithful. Why such caution? Perhaps because the Virgin's warning sounded too much like prophecy, too much like doom. Tucked inside a folder marked non-publicandum, not to be published, I found one of the strangest records. The prophecy of Saint Malachi. It lists mottos for every pope from the 12th century to the very last, called Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman. According to the text, this final pope would reign during the destruction of Rome and the Last Judgment. The Church never declared it authentic, never destroyed it either. Instead, it kept it locked away because whether true or false, it was dangerous. In the margin of one Vatican analysis, a cardinal wrote, "Faith must never be guided by fear of an ending." And yet the people read this as if it were gospel. And today, with Pope Francis often rumored to be the last pontiff, the prophecy stirs unease once more. Not every file ends in devotion. A cabinet labeled Res Rejecta, rejected cases holds reports of supposed miracles exposed as fraud. One tells of a bleeding statue in South America. Investigation revealed hidden pipes pumping animal blood. Another describes a visionary girl in Italy whose nightly messages from the Virgin were traced to a speaker hidden under her bed by her brother. The Vatican's note was blunt. Motivation, notoriety, and profit, file closed. But the chilling part is how many were not condemned as lies. They were left in silence, unresolved, as if the Vatican itself was afraid to declare either heaven or hoax. Reading these files, I realized the Vatican fears miracles as much as it fears heresy. Because a miracle is uncontrollable, it does not pass through papal lips or council chambers. It erupts in fields, in villages, in lonely convents. It speaks directly to the people. If heaven truly spoke, what power would remain to Rome? And so the Church watches, records, classifies, and most of all, waits. Never outright denial, never full embrace. Just silence. But if miracles left the Vatican cautious, the next files left it trembling. For they did not concern visions or healings, but the very foundations of faith itself. Ancient Bibles with missing endings, Gospels never canonized, and scriptures that dared to say the kingdom of God was not in heaven, but within us. Some secrets in the Vatican archives are not painted, sculpted, or whispered by visionaries. They are written, inked onto fragile parchment, copied by trembling hands in candlelight, and then sealed away in drawers that only a handful of men have ever touched. These are not conspiracy theories, not legends. They are texts. Ancient Gospels, letters, and scriptures that once shaped early Christianity, but were later cast aside, not because they were proven false, but because they raised questions the Church was not ready to answer. In a locked cabinet sits the Codex Vaticanus, one of the oldest surviving Greek Bibles dating back to the 4th century. Its pages are haunting in their simplicity. The ink has faded, the edges are frayed, but the words remain clear. And as I read, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The Gospel of Mark does not end with resurrection. It ends with the women at the tomb, finding it empty and running away in fear. No Christ appearing, no triumphant promise, only silence, only dread. A note by a Vatican scribe centuries later adds, the ending was later supplied to strengthen the faith. Strengthen or distort? If the earliest Bible ended with fear, what does that say about the story we now take for granted? Another drawer held copies of the Gospel of Thomas, rediscovered in Egypt in 1945, but quietly kept in Rome long before. It is unlike the Gospels we know. No narrative, no crucifixion, no resurrection, only 114 sayings attributed to Christ. One line reads, "The kingdom of God is inside you and all around you. Not in temples, not in stone. Split a piece of wood and I am there." If that is true, what becomes of the church? What becomes of the priests, the altars, the sacraments? If God is already within, who needs an institution to mediate? Perhaps this is why Thomas was buried. Not because it was false, but because it was too free. Even more shocking is the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. In it, Mary is not the repentant sinner history made her out to be. She is a teacher, a confidant of Christ, even a leader among the apostles. One passage shows the male disciples questioning her authority. Peter scoffs. Did he truly speak privately with a woman and not openly to us? The Vatican's commentary is terse. Authenticity uncertain, risk of doctrinal confusion. But what if it were authentic? What if the first teacher of Christianity was a woman and the church silenced her? Another manuscript, known as the Acts of Pilate, offers a startling twist. It portrays Pontius Pilate not as a ruthless executioner, but as a man bewildered by the mystery of Christ. In one passage, he describes Jesus as a man whose eyes burn like fire, whose words flow like water. Too mystical, too poetic, too dangerous. A papal note in the margin says, "To include this would be to absolve Rome of guilt, therefore it cannot stand." The archives also preserve notes from the early church councils, Nicaea, Chalcedon, where bishops argued fiercely over which books to include in the canon. One forgotten scribe scrawled in the margins of a Nicene record, "These texts are not destroyed. They are to be reserved for deeper study, not public use." Reserved, not false, just hidden. That is the line the church has always walked. Not to burn every unwanted scripture, but to lock them away until time itself decided if humanity was ready. As I turned those fragile pages, I felt the weight of something unspeakable. Christianity could have been different. If Mark had ended in silence, if Thomas had proclaimed the kingdom within, if Mary Magdalene had been recognized as a teacher, if Pilate's words had softened Rome's guilt, our faith, our churches, even our civilization might have taken another path. The Vatican never denied these texts exist. It simply locked them away as if saying, "Not yet, not for you." But truth cannot be sealed forever. And when these Gospels are read, they do not weaken faith, they deepen it. Because they remind us that Christianity was never one single voice, but a chorus, full of debate, contradiction, and longing for meaning. But if hidden Gospels whispered of freedom and doubt, the next files revealed something darker still. Letters never sent, confessions never heard, and popes who wrote in secret what they dared not speak aloud. Words so dangerous they were buried under centuries of silence. If the forbidden Gospels questioned the very roots of Christianity, the next files I uncovered cut even closer to the heart of power. They were not ancient texts or mystical prophecies. They were letters, handwritten drafts in papal script, words never spoken, never read aloud. In the Vatican archives, these documents are filed under a chilling category: Litterae non inviatae, letters never sent, and they reveal something the world rarely dares to admit. Even popes, those who wear the white robe of Peter, wrestled with doubt, fear, and sorrow. The first was written in 1917 by Pope Benedict XV during the First World War. It was addressed not to one ruler, but to all of Europe's kings and emperors. In it, he pleaded, "Will you lay down your arms, if only for the sake of the children? For each cannon fired is not only against your enemy, but against Christ himself." But in the margin, the Secretary of State scrawled a brutal note: "No one will listen, and if they do not listen, your holiness will appear weak." The letter was folded, shelved, and forgotten. Millions more would die in the mud of France and the fire of Verdun. Another document marked reserved for conclave was written by Pope Pius XI in 1938, just before his death. In it, he condemned the rising tide of anti-Semitism in Germany. He wrote, "To be silent is to be complicit. If we do not speak now, history will not call us wise, it will call us guilty." He died before the words could ever be spoken. His successor, Pius XI, chose a quieter path, one that historians still debate, torn between silence and survival. Perhaps the most haunting file was from Pope John Paul III, who reigned for only 33 days before his sudden death in 1978. In his notes, he described plans for sweeping reforms of the Vatican's finances, including investigations into suspicious accounts at the Vatican Bank. One page contained a single underlined sentence: "The Church cannot preach purity if it hides corruption." But he never lived to announce these reforms. Officially, he died of a heart attack, but in the archive, the silence around his death is thicker than any other pope's. In a folder marked private drafts, I found something almost unbearable. A letter Pope John Paul II wrote during the height of the clerical abuse scandal. In his uneven handwriting, he confessed, "I do not know if I have done enough. Every night I pray not only for forgiveness from God, but from the children whose faces I will never see." The letter was never published. Instead, he presented a carefully worded apology. But this private confession revealed the crushing weight of a man who knew history would judge him not for what he did, but for what he could not stop. Even Pope Francis, so often seen as bold and outspoken, has left behind drafts never made public. One addressed to a disgraced cardinal accused of abuse read, "The sin of one man does not destroy the Church, but the covering up does, and for that I fear we are guilty together." It was never sent, perhaps because even a reformer must sometimes bite his tongue to keep the fragile unity of a billion faithful. As I placed these letters back into their boxes, I realized something terrifying and beautiful at once. Popes are not saints in marble. They are men. Men who doubt, who fear, who want to cry out but are told to remain silent. Men who know their words can topple empires or save millions but also shatter faith itself. And so they write their truest words in letters no one was meant to see. The Vatican did not destroy these documents. It preserved them, perhaps as proof that even the holiest among us wrestle with shadows. The archives do not only preserve history, they preserve humanity, its frailty, its silence, its trembling hand hovering over the parchment. And as I closed the final drawer of unsent papal letters, I understood. The greatest secret of the Vatican is not conspiracy, not treasure, not prophecy. It is this, that behind every white robe is a man who bleeds, doubts, and prays that God is listening. The Vatican archives are not only a treasury of documents and letters, they are also a treasury of rituals. Rituals that were meant never to be performed unless the unthinkable happened. In the deepest vaults, past rows of political correspondence and ancient gospels, lies a section unlike any other. It does not hold history. It holds instructions, manuals of silence, codes of secrecy. and rites prepared only for the day when the Vatican itself would fall. One parchment bound in black leather was titled Ordo Exec Pontificis Maximi, the order for the death of a pope. It described step by step what must happen when a pontiff dies. First, the chamberlain must enter the papal quarters, strike the pope's forehead with a silver hammer, and call his baptismal name 3 times. If there is no answer, the pope is declared dead. The door is sealed, the papal ring is destroyed, and the world is told. But in the margin of one 15th century copy was an unnerving note. If no successor comes, the rites end here. The implication was clear. The ritual prepared not only for the death of a pope, but for the death of the papacy itself. Another manuscript, handwritten in coded Latin, bore the title Ordo Rituum Conclavis, the rituals of the conclave. This was not about voting, it was about silence. Every cardinal, every attendant, every servant was sworn to secrecy under pain not only of excommunication but of eternal damnation. The oath began, I swear before God and the shadow of St. Peter that no word leaves these walls. One note in faded ink read, should the oath be broken, every prayer within the conclave shall lose its virtue. Was this symbolic, or was it a genuine belief that the very act of speaking could strip the Church of divine favor? Perhaps the most chilling ritual of all was written in 1945 as the Second World War reached its end. It was a black-bound document labeled only with the date, April 3rd, 1945. Inside was a ritual called Benedictio Ultima, the final blessing. It was to be performed only if the Vatican itself fell, if Rome was captured by fascists, by communists, or by any invading force. The ritual instructed priests how to destroy relics, how to burn sensitive documents, and how to scatter the ashes of saints into the Tiber so they could never be desecrated. The final words of the ritual read, if the Holy See is extinguished in this world, let it rise in the next. This is the last word, and after this there is only silence. The ritual has never been used, but the fact that it exists means the Church prepared for the day when even its heart might stop beating. Not all of the rituals were so apocalyptic. Some were stranger, subtler. One slim manual listed the symbols not to be made public. Among them, a red cord tied across a door meant doctrinal crisis under review. A brown bottle of ink labeled Atramentum Silenti, the ink of silence, used only to write documents that must never be revealed. A black candle lit in the apostolic palace meant the Pope was preparing a decree too dangerous to announce. None of these symbols were ever explained to the faithful, but they shaped centuries of Vatican decision-making. As I read these rituals, I understood something I had never grasped before. The Vatican has always lived with one eye on eternity, and the other on its own possible end. It is not invincible. It has always known that one day it could fall, that the chair of Peter could be empty forever, and so it prepared. Not to save its treasures, not to save its power, but to save silence. Because in the end, silence is the Vatican's final defense. When words become too dangerous, when truth becomes unbearable, when faith trembles, silence remains. And as I placed the last ritual back on its shelf, I realized The Vatican's greatest secret is not what it hides, but what it prepares for. It knows that one day even Rome may burn, even popes may falter, even faith itself may fracture. But when that day comes, the archives will not scream, they will wait, because truth does not belong to us, truth belongs to time.